Hello there. Now, as I promised before in the previous reports, I've put together a chart and I'm going to explain to you from the book, from the good book, how to understand the new covenant that Yahweh God gave. And it says that Yahweh God gave it to Israel. Well, I'm going to show you that's not quite right, because Yahweh God made this covenant to the entire world. Because you be the judge when you read the words with me, and you will see this is the covenant that covers every country, every person in the world. Now, I wanted to do this in a 10-minute clip, but that's going to be impossible. So what you're going to see here is in two parts, part A and B, or part 1 and 2. And to begin with, I'll show you the chart that gives you a diagram of every king, and every king of Judah and every king of Israel. Now, to understand what we're talking about here when we're talking about the new covenant, we have a lot of churches, a lot of Christian groups, a lot of people, they are referring to themselves as people that the new covenant is pointing to. Or they're referring to Israel over there, that is referring to those people as the people under the new covenant. Well, I'm sorry. Have a look at these words with me and you be the judge. Up in this chart, you can see the top row of kings from Jeroboam 922 to 901 BC, going through to when they were taken captive, because all of Israel was taken captive by the Assyrians, and they were transferred over to Assyria to live. That's in 2 Kings 17 and 18. Now, if you realise that there was no Israel left after 721 BC, you also realise then that the prophecies that were referred to by Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is in the area of 626 to 537 BC, Jeremiah is talking about an Israel that is obedient to and keeping the commandments of God. If you look at the top row of kings there, none of them are written in blue. If you look at the kings down the bottom line there, from Rehoboam 922 to 915 BC, all the way through to Eliakim 609 to 598 BC, going through to 597 BC, you're looking at all of the kings of Judah, and only 5 of them kept the commandments of God. And they start with Asa, Jehoshaphat, Azariah, then Hezekiah, and then Josiah, 640 to 609 BC. In other words, only 5 kings of Judah kept the commandments of God. None of the kings in the northern 10 tribes of Israel kept the commandments of God. So if Yahweh God disapproved of, walked away from, exiled the entire 10 tribes of Israel because they were wicked, they were in idolatry, they were not keeping his laws, if you think today that there is an Israel that will be part of his kingdom, part of Yahweh's kingdom, that don't keep his laws, well, think again, because you can see quite clearly there that Israel was not only thrown out by the hand of Yahweh God, you can see that there's no way that they could be redeemed and be replaced back into the original position of being God's people. But the people that are over in Israel today, from 1947, 1948, and referred to as the return of Israel, I'm sorry, that's impossible. All of those tribes that were taken captive 721 BC were displaced. They were relocated over in Assyria. And the women of those men were left back at Shechem, back at Samaria. And then the Assyrians brought their own people back to relocate in Samaria. So there's absolutely no way you could identify who those 10 tribes are today. And you can read all about that in 2 Kings 17 and 18. With the people down in the bottom row, which are the kings of Judah. There was only Judah and Benjamin there. Now, prior to what we're talking about here, there was no such a thing as a Jew, because Jew is a word referring to Judah, Yehudah. And that was not mentioned in any script until the New Testament Bible. So in other words, there was no such a thing as a Jew all the way through. They were Israelites, Israelites only. And you cannot name the entire Israel people from one word of one descriptive name of one tribe called Judah. That's just gross error. It is not correct. Now, in 586, when Jerusalem was taken captive by Babylon, all of those people, that is Judah and Benjamin, and there would have been a sprinkling of the other Jewish tribes, they were taken off and they were exiled into Babylon in 586 BC. And they had to stay there for 70 years before they could get out of that captivity. Now it was by the hand of Yahweh the Creator God that they were exiled, that's Judah, exiled to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. So in other words, it was a planned exile. Why? Because, again, of their idolatry and because they were not keeping his laws. Now after that period of time, and there was a return back to Jerusalem, you've got to realize that that was still not the entire 12 tribes of Israel. There was only a couple of tribes there. And you've got to realize too that bringing that forward up to 1 AD, 1 BC, those people were thoroughly in apostasy. And how do we know that? Well, if you read Jeremiah properly now, and I'm talking about, say, just about every chapter, but my main chapter, 29, 30 and 31, if you read those prophecies there, Jeremiah is telling the story how Yahweh was absolutely livid and angry with those Jews that were exiled into Babylon, and the reason why they had given themselves, as it tells you, prophets, that Yahweh said, they're not my men. I didn't put them down there. The prophets that you say that are prophets are not my prophets. The prophets that you say are giving you all the good news and giving you the right teaching, they're not my men. That's what Yahweh says, they're not my men. So who were they? And what were they into? Well, that's not hard to work out, because it's out of Babylon and Jerusalem, and particularly out of Babylon. That's where these people concocted what is now known as the Talmud and the oral law. And the Talmud and the oral law is a breach of the conditions of what Yahweh gave right from the word go. Yahweh God made sure in his instructions right at the beginning not to add to his words, not to take away from his words, and they ignored that, and they have come up with the Talmud. And you can see today that the people that call themselves Jews over in Israel today and all over the world are Talmud Jews. As a matter of fact, if you go into what they believe in Lubavitch or the Hasidic, these Jews place a higher regard for their Talmud than they do the Torah or the Old Testament. Now let me show you something. To begin with, I'll just give you a look at this map, because in part 2 I can explain it to you further. And you can see on the map here are the names of all of the 12 tribes. Down the bottom you can see Simeon, then you've got Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim. On the left you've got Dan. Then you go up to Manasseh. And if you look there you can see Issachar, Zebulun, Asher and Naphtali. And over the right you've got Manasseh, Gad and Reuben. Now we'll show you in part 2 what does this all mean. Now when we look at the scripture in part 2, I will give you details of the new covenant. And the new covenant is referring to the entire world, as you will see when we go through the words. Be sure you get the next part 2 that will show you who the Israel is today that is referred to in Jeremiah prophecy.